I woke up to the faint hum of the ship's life support systems and the weight of something, or someone, perched on my chest. My eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim, sterile light of the cabin. That's when I saw her, a tiny, radiant figure no taller than my forearm, her bioluminescent skin shimmering in soft hues of blue and gold. She tilted her head, her large, silver eyes studying me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Maybe the endless isolation of this mission had finally broken me. But when her delicate hand reached out to touch the zipper of my jumpsuit, tugging lightly, I froze. "Hey, what are you doing?" I managed, my voice hoarse from sleep. She didn't flinch at my tone. Instead, she pointed at the toolbox resting by the cot, her small, webbed fingers mimicking the motion of unscrewing something. Her gestures were deliberate, almost childlike, but there was a gravity to her gaze that unsettled me. "My tools?" I asked, sitting up carefully. She didn't move, just remained perched on my chest, her translucent wings flickering faintly behind her like static on an old screen. "Yes," she said, the word distorted and halting, as though she plucked it from my language without fully understanding its weight. Her voice was melodic yet alien, a strange harmony that felt both soothing and disarming. "Okay, fine, but can you, get off me first?" She hopped down with surprising grace, her bare feet landing silently on the metallic floor. I reached for the toolbox, still grappling with the sheer absurdity of the situation. My brain finally caught up. This must be one of them. The stranded alien species whose distress signal had brought me to this desolate moon 2 weeks ago. I'd expected to meet a crew of engineers or diplomats, not a solitary, pint-sized emissary with a disconcerting fixation on my tools. I handed her a wrench, half expecting her to inspect it like some primitive relic. Instead, she grasped it with a familiarity that suggested she knew exactly what it was for. "Thanks," she murmured, her tone clipped but not unkind. Then she turned, heading toward the sealed door that separated my quarters from the rest of the ship. "Wait," I called after her, standing. "Who are you? What's your name?" She paused, glancing over her shoulder. "Lyra, and why were you sitting on me?" Her lips curved slightly, the closest thing to a smile I'd seen. "You didn't wake up when I called." Before I could respond, she was gone, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. Lyra returned hours later, just as I was finishing a meal of rehydrated pasta. She stood in the doorway, her slight frame dwarfed by the towering bulkhead, and stared at me as though she were weighing something in her mind. "Can I help you?" I asked, setting down my fork. She stepped inside, moving with a fluidity that made her appear more shadow than substance. "Your tools," she said simply. "Right? You need help with repairs, I assume?" She nodded but didn't elaborate. Instead, she approached the workbench where my tools lay scattered and ran her fingers over the array with something akin to reverence. "You humans," she began, her voice softer this time, "you build with such purpose. Every piece, every design, it's so deliberate." I frowned, unsure how to respond. "That's kind of the point of tools." "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's more than that. It's personal, as if each tool holds a part of you." Her words struck a chord I didn't fully understand. Perhaps it was the isolation of the past few months or the disintegration of my marriage that made her observation feel oddly profound. My wife had always teased me about my attachment to my tools, calling it endearing during our early years together and obsessive as time went on. "So, what's the problem with your ship?" I asked, steering the conversation back to safer territory. She hesitated, her expression darkening. "Our core system is failing. Without it, we cannot leave this moon. And you need my help to fix it? Yes. Her simplicity was both frustrating and fascinating. I gestured to the bench. Then let's get started. The next few hours passed in tense silence as I followed Lyra to her ship. It was smaller than I'd imagined, a sleek, silver vessel nestled in the shadow of a jagged rock formation. Inside, the air was warmer, filled with a faint, floral aroma that reminded me of spring on Earth. She led me to the core chamber, where the damage was immediately apparent. The intricate machinery was unlike anything I'd seen, a symphony of glowing conduits and interlocking crystalline components. This is advanced, I admitted, crouching to examine the fractured components. Can you fix it? She asked, her voice laced with both hope and doubt. Maybe, I said honestly, but it's going to take time. She didn't respond, but her wings flickered faintly, a subtle indication of her anxiety. As I worked, I became increasingly aware of Lyra's presence. She hovered close, her gaze fixed on my hands with an intensity that bordered on intrusive. At one point, her fingers brushed against mine as she handed me a tool, and I felt a strange warmth that lingered longer than it should have. You don't talk much, do you? I said, trying to break the tension. She tilted her head. Talking is inefficient. Fair enough, I muttered, returning to the task at hand. But as the hours wore on, I found myself speaking anyway. I told her about Earth, about the sprawling cities and endless oceans she'd never seen. I told her about my work as an engineer and the sense of purpose it gave me. And before I could stop myself, I told her about my wife, how our once perfect marriage had crumbled under the weight of unspoken resentment and growing distance. Lyra listened without interruption, her silver eyes never leaving mine. When I finally fell silent, she said, "Humans feel so much. It's overwhelming." "Tell me about it," I said with a bitter laugh. She reached out then, her small hand resting on my forearm. "But it makes you strong, stronger than you know." Her touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I pulled away, more out of confusion than discomfort. "We should get back to work," I said, my voice harsher than I intended. Lyra nodded, her expression unreadable. But as we continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that her words and her touch had left a mark deeper than I cared to admit. By the time we returned to my ship, the core repairs still unfinished. The line between duty and something far more dangerous had already begun to blur. The following day, Lyra was waiting for me in the cargo bay. She was perched on a crate, her luminous wings folded neatly against her back, watching as I stepped into the room. Her eyes, silver and unblinking, followed me with a focus that made my pulse quicken. "You're early," I said, setting down my gear. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her tone neutral, but the faint flicker in her wings betrayed her unease. "Your tools, may I help again?" I hesitated. She had proven to be surprisingly adept the previous day, her small hands precise and nimble, her understanding of her ship's alien mechanisms sharper than I'd anticipated. Still, there was something disconcerting about her presence, something I couldn't quite name. "Sure," I said finally, "but let's stay focused." We worked side by side, surrounded by the quiet hum of my equipment. As I repaired a fractured circuit module, Lyra passed me tools without needing to be asked, her movements fluid and intuitive. Occasionally, I caught her watching me instead of the task at hand, her gaze soft yet piercing. "Do you miss her?" she asked suddenly. I froze, my hand tightening around the soldering iron. "Who?" "Your mate, the one you spoke of yesterday." The question landed like a blow. I hadn't meant to confide so much the day before, but the combination of exhaustion and her quiet, unjudging presence had loosened my tongue. Now, hearing her bring it up felt like a breach of some unspoken boundary. "I don't know," I said, forcing my attention back to the circuit. It's complicated, complicated, she repeated, as though tasting the word. Your kind seems to live in that space, between clarity and confusion. It's not that simple. No, she agreed, stepping closer. But it is fascinating. Her proximity sent a ripple of tension through me. She wasn't just standing near. She was there within arm's reach, her small frame emanating an almost magnetic pull. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the task in front of me. What about your people? I asked, hoping to shift the conversation. Don't you have someone waiting for you? My people have different bonds, she said. We do not pair as you do. Connections are fluid, ephemeral. That sounds lonely, perhaps, but it also means we feel no shame for what we desire. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I glanced at her, and for a moment, the room seemed smaller, the distance between us non-existent. Then she turned away, her wings flickering faintly as she reached for another tool. Hours passed in a tense rhythm, the quiet punctuated only by the soft clink of metal and the occasional hum of my scanner. The repairs were progressing slower than I'd hoped, but I couldn't deny the strange ease with which we worked together. Lyra's presence, while unsettling, felt oddly natural, like a piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized was missing. At one point, as I leaned over the console to adjust a relay, she moved closer, her hand brushing against mine. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. Sorry, she said softly, though there was no apology in her eyes. It's fine, I muttered, stepping back to put space between us. She tilted her head, studying me. You are afraid of what? Of what you feel? I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. She wasn't wrong, and that terrified me more than anything. The turning point came later, during a break in our work. We sat on the floor of the cargo bay, the tools scattered around us like the remnants of a battle. Lyra had taken to watching me again, her expression unreadable. You are different from others of your kind, she said finally. How so? You carry a weight, but you do not let it crush you. Many would. Her words struck a chord I didn't want to acknowledge. I had carried plenty of weights over the years. My marriage, my work, my own insecurities, and while they hadn't crushed me, they'd left their marks. Maybe I'm just stubborn, I said, attempting to deflect. Or strong, she countered. The sincerity in her voice made it impossible to dismiss her. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't noticed before, vulnerability. For all her confidence and otherworldly grace, there was a fragility to her, a quiet ache that mirrored my own. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers intertwined with mine, her touch light but deliberate. You don't have to be afraid, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I was, not of her, but of myself, of the feelings she stirred, the lines I was dangerously close to crossing. The moment shattered when a warning beep echoed from my console, signaling an incoming message. I pulled my hand back as though burned, scrambling to my feet. It's probably the diagnostics, I said quickly, avoiding her gaze as I moved to check the console. Behind me, Lyra remained seated, her wings dimming slightly. For the first time, she looked small, almost fragile. The message wasn't from the diagnostics. It was from my wife. It was short, clinical, a request for an update on my mission. No warmth, no curiosity, just a handful of words that felt more like an obligation than genuine concern. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and sadness. You care for her, Lyra said behind me, her voice soft but firm. I turned to face her, my emotions warring within me. "I don't know what I feel anymore." She stood, her silver eyes meeting mine. "Perhaps you should decide." Her words were a challenge, and they cut deeper than I expected. As much as I wanted to dismiss them, I couldn't. She was right. I couldn't keep straddling the line between clarity and confusion, between duty and desire. But deciding meant confronting truths I wasn't ready to face, truths that had already begun to unravel the careful control I'd built around my life. And Lyra, with her piercing gaze and disarming presence, was at the heart of it all. The next morning, the hum of the ship felt different, heavier, as though the air itself had thickened with unspoken words. Lyra was gone when I woke, and the silence in my quarters seemed almost oppressive in her absence. I couldn't shake the image of her standing before me, her eyes full of understanding, yet untouched by the turmoil that churned within me. I moved through my day mechanically, checking the systems, recalibrating equipment, but my mind kept drifting back to her, her touch, her words, the way she made me feel both seen and unsettled. There had been moments between us that I couldn't ignore, and the guilt of what I had allowed to unfold hung over me like a storm cloud. By midday, I couldn't avoid it any longer. I went to the cargo bay, hoping to find Lyra, to finish what we had started, to fix what had been broken in my mind. She was there, crouched by the workbench, her small hands gliding over the alien technology with the same delicate precision I'd come to expect. But when she looked up, her eyes were distant, guarded. "I'm sorry," I said, stepping forward. "I shouldn't have let things go this far." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood, walking toward me with a grace that made the air seem to shimmer around her. "You chose this," she said quietly, her voice as steady as ever. "It wasn't an accident." The word stung, but she was right. I had chosen to confide in her, to let my guard down in ways I hadn't allowed myself in years. I had chosen to cross the line between professional and personal, between the familiar and the forbidden. "Maybe I needed to," I replied, my voice rough. "Maybe I needed someone to listen to me. And now," I swallowed hard, "now I need to fix what I've broken." She was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching mine as though weighing my sincerity. Then, without warning, she reached out, her fingers brushing my wrist. "You are not broken," she said softly, "but your path is not here." I looked down at her hand, the warmth of her touch seeping through my jumpsuit. "What do you mean?" Lyra's gaze softened, her expression unreadable. "This is not your place. You have a bond to someone else." The truth hit me like a slap to the face. The realization of what I had been avoiding. The fact that no matter how lonely I felt, no matter how comforting Lyra's presence had been, I was still tethered to my wife. My fractured, distant marriage wasn't something I could escape from with the flick of a switch. "I need to go back," I said, the words coming out in a strained whisper. "I have to face what I've been running from." Lyra nodded, her hand falling away from my wrist. "Then go. Your tools can fix machines, but only you can fix yourself." I wanted to say more, to explain that it wasn't as simple as she made it sound, that there were too many layers of hurt and betrayal between me and my wife for things to just fix themselves. But I knew she was right. I had to return to Earth, confront the wreckage of my relationship and rebuild it, or walk away completely. The following hours were a blur of activity. I informed the ship's control center of my decision to return, initiating the jump back to Earth's orbit. As the engines powered up, I couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. Lyra had stayed out of sight for the remainder of my preparations, and though I had expected to feel a sense of loss at her absence, I didn't. Instead, there was only the quiet weight of the choice I had made. Before I left the ship entirely, I went to the cargo bay one last time. The glow of Lyra's vessel dimly illuminated the room, but she wasn't there. I wasn't sure what I expected, some grand farewell or emotional confrontation, but there was nothing, only silence. And then, as I turned to leave, I saw it, a small object resting on the workbench. It was an artifact, something she had given me in the heat of our time together, though I hadn't fully understood its significance. The glowing, crystalline object that had felt both like a gift and a challenge. I reached for it, holding it in my palm as its subtle warmth spread through my fingers. It was a token, a reminder of a brief, profound connection, one I would carry with me as a quiet lesson in vulnerability and strength. The journey back to Earth was long and uneventful, but every moment felt like a reset. The white noise of space was replaced with the chaos of my thoughts, and I found myself grappling with the reality of the choices that awaited me. When I finally arrived, I was met with the cold, mechanical atmosphere of the station, familiar, sterile, and yet completely alien in its own right. My wife's message was still sitting in my inbox, unread for days. I opened it, my heart thudding in my chest. It was short, too short. No warmth, no love, only the practical words of a partner who had long since checked out. But there was something else beneath the surface of that message. A crack. I sent a message in return, telling her I was home. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew one thing. The path forward would require honesty with her, but also with myself. And as I stood there, staring out at the distant stars, I knew that whatever happened next, I would carry a piece of Lyra with me, not as a longing or an escape, but as a reminder that sometimes it takes an unexpected encounter to see yourself clearly, to understand that no matter how far we travel or how lost we feel, there is always a way back to where we truly belong. The end of one journey was only the beginning of another.